No, I think it would be good to move to kind of the moral argument of all of
Mm,
this. So,
mm.
so just to be, I guess I just want to like nail this down. When do you think an abortion at any point is acceptable, or do you think as soon as the egg is fertilized, you have a completely separate human?
I think abortion at any point is impermissible given the epistemic limitations that we have currently about the individual status of a human of a fetus.
Okay.
I think that's the moral stance. Now, there can be evidence out there which does convince me otherwise. Yet at the same time, I do not think that evidence is given to us now, and that the majority of the evidence that we do have is in favor of the position that I currently hold, which is impermissible throughout, due to the scientific reasons I've given previously. With my argument of like it's a living human being, regardless if it's a person or whatnot, it's a living human being. For all we know, living human beings should not be terminated. Therefore, abortion is wrong. That's the stance I hold. And for all I know, that I suppose is separate from whether it's a person or not. Because I think if you're just looking at the science and you don't jump into what it means to be a person, I think you get quite a bare bones and I think a very clear distinction of the situation, I suppose.
Okay. So it seems like this argument is resting heavily on um, its kind of teleological possibility that it will, be born, right? That it will fully develop into a separate life,
Yes.
or that
Mm-hmm.
it's likely to. Okay.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, my view on abortion is definitely, I'll admit, is a more extreme view because I think, this we're going to be blurring between morality and legality. Um, I think that it should be permissible up into like as long as you're pregnant and it's not separate, that it should be permissible. Now, when we come to the subject of third trimester abortions, in principle, if you were 9 months and you just decided on a whim, yeah, I want to get an abortion, I would say on principle that's acceptable. In reality, the only people that ever get third trimester abortions are for one of three reasons. Either it's the life of the mother, the fetus is non-viable, or it's already stillborn, or there's like a severe fetal deformity. So Tay-Sachs disease comes to mind. And for people who are unfamiliar with Tay-Sachs disease, it's a disease that is comic to ethnic Jews. And it basically causes fats deposits to grow inside of the brain. And you can be born and, live a couple years on Tay-Sachs, but you would, all the science kind of says that you're in agonizing pain the whole time. So that would be one of the acceptable that would be the fetal deformity argument of why it would be permissible to get an abortion in the third trimester.
Mm.
And if somebody came up to me who was 9 months pregnant and asked, do you think it's okay if I get an abortion just on a whim, right? Because most people actually agree that it's okay to get a third trimester abortion if it's like life of the mother, or
Mm. Yeah.
viability and stuff like that. Most people really do. There are some people that don't. There are very, people that really do not. And I can go on about various politics in the U.S. But if someone came up to me and said, "Hey, I just want to do this on a whim," would I recommend that? No, because I think that one, the procedure to do it is more dangerous. It's more complicated. It's just not something that I would recommend. If I were a doctor, would I perform it? No, because I don't. I think there would be serious ethical problems, and you could potentially lose your license. Like I don't know how it is in the UK or Europe. Is UK still part of Europe, by the way, or is that kind of an open question?
Mm. It's well, look, I'm not much keen into UK politics, but I
Okay.
think currently, I think they're as far as I know, I think they still have Europeans still share the status they had previously. Yeah, at the same time, the government is trying to separate as quickly as possible, and how that procedure is going to occur over the next few years, I have absolutely no clue. But I think that's
Yeah.
as much as
So
I can say.
Yeah, so I don't know how medical ethics works in Europe or the UK, but you can lose your medical license in America without ever committing a crime, right? If you, do malpractice or you engage in what is considered unethical medical behavior. And so if I was a doctor, I would not perform a third-term abortion just on a whim, because I do think that it would run into some ethical violation, right? It could put a person in more danger than giving birth. So that's kind of all of the different variant ways. In principle, yes. In reality, I don't think that ever actually happens, that people get to that late. Usually, if you get to 8-9 months, you want a baby.
Yeah.
Right. That really is the reality. If you've gone through that much, you really want a kid. And all the people that I've ever known or I've heard about who get third trimester abortions, it's really devastating for them because they really did want a child. And it's just a situation where they really don't have a choice. I mean, they could die, or, they don't want a fetus that's going to be born in agonizing pain, or a baby that's going to be born in agonizing pain and might die within a couple days, etc. That's the reality of it. In my own morals, would I recommend somebody do it on a whim? No. And if I was a doctor, would I perform it on a whim? No. So that's kind of how I would answer all of those different questions about when abortion should be done. But legally, I do not think the government should prohibit a person's bodily autonomy, because that's really what it comes down to me. Like, I believe that you should have absolute sovereignty over your body, and I don't believe the government should have any restrictions on your bodily sovereignty. Now, that doesn't mean the government can't say, well, we have to have certain medical precautions, right? We want our hospitals to have certain standards that they can't skimp just because they want to make a profit. So I kind of agree with that. But in the United States, that is often used by pro-life groups on abortion clinics, some of which, mainly do first trimester abortions, which can either be done medically, right? You can just give someone a pill and it occurs. And there's also, very unrisky surgical things that they could do. And what we found in the United States among pro-life groups is that they will burden abortion clinics with medical requirements that are not necessary, right? They might, like they might make a requirement that's like, you have to have a hallway a certain size, and it's completely arbitrary. It has nothing to do with the actual safety of it. So in that sense, I could see, I've seen how the government has abused its ability to regulate medical processes and make sure that medicine is safe in order to do that. So that's something that I would oppose. But I do think that the state has, they do have a certain obligation to make sure that health facilities, beyond the own health facilities' ethical obligations, are being as safe as possible in that sense. But there's also, as I've seen in America, the United States, it's abused a lot for very specific political reasons, even though there's not a medical necessity for that.
Yes. Well, I suppose America is, I dare say, almost synonymous with politics, political powers being abused for whatever purposes, which may so happen, I dare say. But there's two questions I have here, just given what you've just said. On one hand, I have the question of, well, what's the reason for for you to think, at least medically or from a medical ethics perspective, of third-month trimester children being ethically, well, you shouldn't do it on a whim, in so much as, I suppose, of course, this ties back a bit into the metaphysical argument we had previously. They haven't had their first breath of the world yet. So I suppose, at least from that perspective, I'm not exactly sure what the symmetry breaker is between the two perspectives. That's one question I have. And on the second question, or the second point I have, I completely agree with you that the state's goal and the state's purpose is to protect people's choices and bodily autonomy to the greatest degree. I completely agree with that. What I do think at the same time is, however, that from the arguments I've given previously, I do not think the fetus is part of the human's body, the mother's body. I simply deny the fact that when someone says one should have bodily autonomy, that the fetus is part of that bodily autonomy. I do not think that that's the case. And of course, that will tie into potential discussions about the violinist argument, and we can talk about that later. But I do think, as a third thing, an extension of that is that the law should follow closest to should follow definitions which can have a clear and distinct definition, or at least a very clear and distinct definition. Hence, not metaphysical, nothing which is like, oh, this might be a person or might not be a person. It should be following at least something which is semi-agreeable on all fronts, which is the science of it, to say, well, does it follow 7 life processes? Yes or no. Does it have the potential to carry out 7 processes? Yes or no. I think those are clear arguments that can be raised. And if you follow each of those questions to the fullest extent, I think you do come to the conclusion that a fetus is a living human being, and that the law should protect that. And that is ultimately why I say, that's why I quite like the first argument that I gave, is less so about its metaphysical implications. Of course, there are metaphysical implications which I think are important, but I do think it is at least clear enough to say, well, all right, there might be further distinctions and categorizations of it, but at least from the broadest extent, these are pretty simple premises that can be followed and tested quite clearly. And I think from a pragmatic perspective as well, that is what the law should follow, I think. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, real quick, I would just say that any of these medical, ethical, and moral, to me, they all are grounded on unsaid metaphysical principles. Does that make sense? Right? Like if you absolutely believe that a human person begins at fertilization, that's a metaphysical statement.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Mm-hmm.
So all of these things, to me, are grounded on, at the very least, unsaid medical. Unsaid metaphysical principles. And that's really why I wanted to have this discussion with you, because I had a couple other people that wanted to have an abortion debate, and it would have just been all politics, because I wanted to be able to get into the philosophy of it. Because I do believe, like, all of these things, you know, in order to really answer that question, you do have to answer the metaphysical, or there are just metaphysical implications, is just kind of what I'm saying. As far as why would I not recommend that somebody gets a 3rd trimester abortion on a whim. And again, I'm not a super expert on the exact medical procedures. I would not recommend it because it's more dangerous, it's more expensive. Those would be the reasons. It's
so
really
got nothing to do with the metaphysical principles behind it, then?
No, not for me, at least. No. And that's the thing, is like most people would oppose on metaphysical principles, on all principles, and most forms of 3rd trimester abortion, because if you look at pictures, it looks a lot like a baby, right? And so we kind of naturally, I mean, this is part of our literal DNA, is that when we see babies, we are attracted to them and want to care for them. It's literally part of how we've evolved, is to, you know, want to care and take care of that. So I think for a lot of people, that's why they get so skittish when it comes to 3rd trimester, even sometimes 2nd trimester is why I think a lot of people get skittish. And remind me of the last thing, the other thing that you said. I apologize.
The last thing I said was purely the idea that if we're going to talk about laws, I completely agree with you about the body autonomy part. I think the role of the law is to ensure that people have the maximum amount of the maximum ability to perform choices with their own body. And I'll add a small degree to that people should also be enforced to bear the responsibilities of their action, because I think without the responsibilities of the action, it's very difficult to say you should have the choice and you don't have the responsibility. I think that's a problem. And I think, although some people might say, oh, that's totalitarian, I think it's completely reasonable to say that if you're doing something, the role of the law is to make sure that you're responsible for what you've done, in the same way that, of course, clear cases, murder, whatnot, you're responsible, you've done that choice, you have to be responsible for it. But I think in the same way, it's like if you've made a decision about something else, and I suppose in this situation it might be just promiscuous sexual behavior around the place. I'm not necessarily saying you should.
By the way, that's my favorite type of sexual behavior.
Wonderful. but I dare say that I think the law should definitely allow for that, but at the same time, it should also ensure that responsibility is taken for the consequences of said action. Now, of course, on the side as well, what I was also arguing for is that I think when we're talking about the law, in order for the law to work, it has to act on very clear and presentable and well-defined scientific principles, or not even scientific, but just clear and well-defined principles. I don't think metaphysical arguments make the cut just because of how much debate there can be over it, as seen for the 1 hour of debate we've had just now on metaphysical discussions. And I think it's safe to say we're both very reasonable people, and as a result, I don't think the law can allow for such a discussion or distinctions where two reasonable people can get together and look at something and say, we have two completely different conclusions. I don't think the law can allow for such vaguity. As a result, I would say the law can only base things on things which can have clear, definitive answers, like science. And I'm not saying science is God or anything like that, and not God as in a deity, but as the main fundamental principle. I'm not a proponent of scientism, but I think for what we know, at least when it comes to the debate of abortion, science is the clearest thing that we have. And in that science, what we clearly can see is the 7 life processes, and the potential is the same as actual when it comes to the application of 7 life processes to what is a living human being or not. And based on those two principles, I'll say, legally speaking, the fetus is a living human being, and as a result, no abortion. That's my take on the situation, because that's, to me, is the only clear-cut thing where you could say, all right, can it do this, can it do that, can it do that, ticks off all the boxes. Every reasonable person can look at that and say, well, all right, that's what it is. And from that perspective, I would say, yeah, that's the case. Of course, if we have further scientific developments in the future, the thing could change very easily. But for now, with what we know so far, I would say that's a good perspective to look at it legally.
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and grant that, you know, at the moment of fertilization, that's a human person. I'll just go ahead and grant that. I think that if you were, and that it has its own body and it has a certain level of bodily sovereignty that is equivalent to all other people's, I guess what I would say is that if you were to grant, a fetus or just an unborn person, that level of bodily sovereignty, you would be granting them a type of right and sovereignty that once they're born, they'll never have, and that they'll never have throughout the rest of their life, that they can unilaterally control another person's sovereignty. Because at that point, it becomes a conflict between two different sovereignties, the sovereignty of the mother and the bodily sovereignty of the mother and the bodily sovereignty of the fetus. And I do think that the sovereignty of the mother is always going to take precedence. Now, when it comes, I don't know if that answers that question or if I can continue on.
Perhaps before we continue on, I'll just kind of raise a point which I've said previously, which was, I think the intrinsic value of a human being is tied to them, both to the ability to have a right to life and a right not to perish. That's the sovereignty I'm granting. Whether that is to someone else or not is a completely different thing. I don't really care about those extrinsic factors, just because I think if you're tying directly to the most kind of structured or principled position, which is value includes a basic right to life and the right not to perish, then I think that right carries on throughout your body and throughout your life, and that doesn't change. And I'll say that that's what the right that the fetus has, and not to them, like whatever to the mother's body or whatever it is, they have the basic right to life in the same way that I think everyone, now some conservatives might think I'm a bit of a communist for saying this, but I think everyone should have a basic example or a basic ability to live in the world. They shouldn't have great conditions and great phenomenal things, but I think everyone has a basic right to clean, to water to drink, basic food to sustain themselves. Of course, they don't need to eat 3-course meals a day, but if they're eating a potato every day, fine by me. But they have to have at least some basic form of sustenance that people should be working, has a moral obligation to provide to everyone. I think that's a moral obligation. So as a result, I think from my perspective, at least under my work, I think there's a completely consistent view to say that everyone has a basic right to life, regardless of external factors. And that's just kind of the framework that I'm trying to present here. I suppose, okay, so in response to the right that they'll never have again, I would say, do you believe that people have a right to public health care, like basic public health care?
Yes, absolutely.
What's supporting public health care? I'll say taxpayers' money is supporting public health care. But then, so they are using what someone else owned in the past and what someone else earned in the past to support their life. Would you not say that's a very similar situation if you consider that we own our money?
I don't equivocate bodily sovereignty with property sovereignty.
Well, I think they are But would you not say that one's right over one's property is the same over one's right over their body? Would you disagree with that?
No.
On what
Because I believe you have an absolute right over your body. You don't necessarily have an absolute right over your property.
Okay, so that, I suppose that might make a distinction, but I would say, well, your right over your body goes as so much as you have right over your body and not over what is not part of your body, which I argue the fetus is not part of the mother's body, which is where the distinction probably arises later on. But I would say, well, and tying it to the violinist analogy, I would say, if that is a good analogy, I think it's a false. I think it's not a good analogy, just because I think the way in which a fetus comes about is very different from the way in which a violinist wakes up and finds someone strapped to someone in a chair. I would say I don't think it's a very good analogy, and I don't really think there's any other analogy which could be raised, which is exactly the same as someone having a child or not even to use a child, like getting pregnant, right? I don't think there's any direct analogy there, but even then, I would not go so far to grant that the mother has the right to terminate the fetus just because the fetus is causing an inconvenience or has problems in the future. I think that that's a completely separate discussion.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, it's not just that it's an inconvenience; it's that if you were to compare the procedure of an abortion to giving birth, we know for a fact that giving birth is medically more dangerous than having an abortion. And so to me, if a woman wants to say, look, I don't want to take the risk of giving birth, no matter how low it is, because it could potentially, I mean, this isn't the case, probably in the case of the UK or places that have socialized Medicare, but we have, or socialized medicine. But in the US, I mean, we still have very high maternal mortality rates, especially among Black women. They just, it's insane. And so I think even if you argue it's like you made the gamble to have sex and to get pregnant, I mean, I would argue it's not a necessary consequence that you are going to get pregnant. It is a possibility. But the simple fact that it could very well be more dangerous for you to give birth is enough of a reason for you to be able to assert your own bodily autonomy over the potential of the fetus to literally cause you to die in that situation, especially because the fetus itself is completely dependent. I mean, there are, the way that even fetal cells implant themselves in the uterine, and I guess this could come down to more of a matter of perspective. You could say that it's literally, it's like an invasive thing inside of the uterine wall, and that there is this kind of back and forth challenge between these two bodies. And so just based on the fact that it's literally more dangerous to give birth than it is to terminate a pregnancy or to not be pregnant, that itself trumps whatever potential rights that a person as a fetus has. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of what my argument for that, even if you grant that a fetus is a human person, would be. So in the same sense that if we take whoever, so say you're a violinist and I'm your bartender, and I just keep giving you liquor over and over, and you're an alcoholic, and you keep telling me I went to my doctor and I have liver cirrhosis and I'm going to die, and I keep manipulating you into drinking more and more, even though I know all these facts, and you get to the point where you need a liver transplant, even though I was definitely one of the people responsible for giving you liver cirrhosis. You still don't have the right to force me to do that, even though that's a case of me being responsible for you needing a part of someone else's body, potentially my own or anybody's. But just because I caused that, I still don't believe that that's enough of an obligation to force me to donate part of my liver. And so I would extrapolate that, or use that as kind of an analogy for the fetus woman dichotomy that exists. That's how I would respond, especially to the argument that, because it is a significant argument that you make, that you chose to have sex. Well, you chose to, that can get tricky, but you had sex and there is a possibility of you getting pregnant. And so at the very least, metaphysically, there's a causal relationship. And then morally, we can go further and say, well, that's a responsibility. That causal relationship becomes a responsibility. And so, yeah, that is, even if you have that responsibility, you also have the responsibility to yourself. So if you think, hey, I mean, the risk of me giving birth and having serious complications or dying is too much, then I should be able, in order to save my own life, to be able to terminate it. Or, you know, in the argument I just made, if I am directly responsible for you getting liver cirrhosis and you're about to die unless somebody gives you a liver transplant, and then the most likely candidate is to come to me as the person responsible, and I'm like, hey, no, liver transplant, that's too medically dangerous to me. I'm not willing to do that. I still think that holds.
Well, I think responsibility, especially, well, I would say responsibility, let's talk about that first, is something which is not to oneself, but towards a higher goal or a higher aim. And this might be a bit idealistic for me, but I do think that the very concept of responsibility, the difference between one acting based on responsibility or one acting based on just on a whim, is precisely the fact that one holds themselves to a further standard which they themselves are not part of. For example, when I say I am responsible to you, I'm not just saying I am responsible for you. I'm also responsible to a duty that I have for you. So there is a further extrinsic property within the idea of responsibility. Because if it was just tied to myself, then, well, there's nothing much holding responsibility to be held. And that's why I think the law should uphold responsibility. It's because without a law, there is no practical way for people to be held responsible for what they do. In the same way, I think responsibility metaphysically requires a further thing to hold one to what they've been responsible for. Now, I suppose on the side as well, I think when you talked about the bodily sovereignty of the mother, I think there's a few things that could be raised there. Firstly, I do not think that the death of the potential death is something which is a sufficient reason to change to challenge the pre-existing or the certain death of the fetus, because on one hand we have the chance of someone potentially having complications, and then we have the chance of someone definitely being terminated. Now, of course, I should say fetus just to be scientifically accurate here, but the fetus being terminated is precisely the case that they are being terminated. The chance of giving birth may not lead to termination. And I'll also say that people's right to choice is a secondary right under the primary right which everyone has, which is the right to life, and that the right to life is the one and only right which trumps everything else. Hence why we can say people have the right to healthcare, basic healthcare and food and water, is because we respect the right to life as the fundamental right upon which people who are paying taxes, although even if they don't want the taxes to go to people's life-sustaining things, still have to pay the taxes to sustain people's lives, because we believe that people's rights is the fundamental right to life, is the fundamental right above everything else. And of course, there are other discussions around that, but I think, and it does tie into other metaphysical properties and ideas, and I suppose I'm somewhat curious to hear how you would define rights and values. But at the same time, I think that at least from the perspective of the law, I think the right to life is the fundamental right upon which most legal systems are based upon and take as granted.
First of all, you guys heard it here first. Joshua Yen is a communist. We've determined that automatically. I want everyone to be aware.
Should I say the Russian national anthem now?
I think I have it somewhere. We could talk about that in a second, actually. The thing is that the fetus is the one with the imposition on the bodily sovereignty of the mother, right? And so, you know, I mean, someone gets pregnant, they have responsibility. They may have responsibilities to their other children that they already have. They have a responsibility to stay alive for them. They have a responsibility to, you know, whatever other things that are going on in their life. I think that the argument of responsibility holds equally well for those. And so the risk that could end your life, prevent you from doing that, even if it's a small one, I think that would, in my opinion, that would still hold. So that doesn't sway me personally. Did I answer your question?
I suppose the response would still be like they still have made the choice. Like it was an active choice to have a child, I suppose, and that would still be the fundamental.
Well, it might not have been an active choice to make a child, but they made the choice to do a process that made, of that. But then again, I mean, they made that same choice to have their previous children, and they still have those obligations to those previous children. Yeah, so that's how I would respond. And I think this is just another area where we're going to come to an impasse on what we believe.